Welcome back, everyone. We are starting with the climate economics session this morning. Rules are still the same as yesterday, so we will have 25 minutes for presentations, 10 minutes for discussion, and 5 minutes for the debate and the response to discussion at the end. So we are starting with Anastasios from University of Surrey, and he will be talking about optimal climate policy in the global economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again. Excellent. So thanks to the organizers for having me here, and thanks to I want to thank in advance my discussant who got an updated draft very recently, so it's not his fault, my fault, sent him something very recently, an updated draft. And this is preliminary work, so it's the first time I present that, so I would really appreciate your comments. So can you hear me well, or there is some, okay, because there's a weird echo for me. I hope it's not for you. Okay, so I'm asking a very elementary question in this paper, and the question I'm asking is, how should we design climate policies in a global interconnected economy? And, climate change and the climate externality has some particular features, and the features is that it has two dimensions. One is a domestic dimension. That means private firms do not internalize the damages from energy use, something we understand well. That's why people go introduce carbon taxes to correct this externality. And second, there's an international dimension, which means emissions in other parts of the world, like I just brought an example, industrial area in China, in Shenzhen, emissions in Shenzhen may create damages to some place, in completely different place of the world, like Utah in the United States. So in one word, externality, the climate externality is global, which obviously necessitates the need for coordination. We understand that very well, and policymakers understand that very well. For example, that's the UN Paris Agreement in 2015. And also when we write down models, we typically write down a model of the entire economy, the world economy, or even if we have a multi-country setup, we may think of the Pareto optimal solution, Pareto optimal policy that corrects the externality. And now,
attention, please. The fire alarm is about to be tested. Please take no action.
Perfect timing. Okay. So, however,
attention, please. Attention, please. The fire alarm is about to be tested. Please take no action.
Should I take action? You tell me. Should I continue? Okay. Okay. However, there is fire. Who is that? Trump. Trump comes in and says, forget the Paris Agreement. Or
Attention, please. Please leave the building immediately. Please leave the building immediately by the nearest exit. Do not use the lifts.
okay. Let's hope it's over. So, there is lack of coordination, the Paris Agreement effectively is not necessarily enforced. You may have the US that withdrew from it, then they joined again. You have China that, maybe, let's not say not following the various targets. So, a crucial question that comes in is, what do we do when there's not this lack of coordination? And
Attention, please. attention, please. Fire alarm test is now complete.
Okay.
Please respond to all future fire alarms.
Okay. So we may think, putting coordination aside, what should be the optimal unilateral policies? And there's a particular element, because, when we look at climate and various emissions worldwide, there's a particular feature that you see in the data, which will play a big role in the model I'm going to build, is we have large emitters. And also, these countries that are large emitters, also these countries are really large participants in international capital markets. Let's see a graph. It will be the only data I have in the paper. Let's see the annual carbon dioxide emissions for the last 150 years. You can see, obviously, the enormous increase, and you can also see the little blip of the pandemic, huge when the pandemic hit, but overall little blip. And then you can see, China, huge chunk of emissions are coming from China, the United States, the European Union, which is the purple line, or India, that's growing. Let's see also in terms of shares. China, for example, is like about 30% of emissions. The United States, about 13%. The European Union is about 7 or 8%. India is at the same level like European Union. So we have large emitters. And unfortunately, I should have put in, I don't have like a graph for how big these countries are in terms of participation in international markets, capital markets. So that's my motivation. So what I'm going to do is, essentially this will be also a roadmap for my presentation, is I'm going to set up a multiple country model. I'm going to study first the cooperative policy that will correct the externality. Obviously, the externality is global, so effectively you'll have a global Pigouvian carbon tax that corrects the externality, the negative externality. And then I'll move beyond cooperation. And the way I'm going to think about beyond cooperation is I'm going to have just two countries. Let's call the one home, the other foreign. And there will be two large countries, and hope will be a large country that will be facing essentially a passive foreign country. Large in what sense? It will be a large emitter, and also it will be a lot of intertemporal trading. That means it will be a large borrower or saver. I emphasize a large. Why? Because my country, my home country here, will have market power in international capital markets. That means we'll try to understand how you manipulate world interest rates. I'm going to have a one good economy, so I will not be able to talk about terms of trade. I will be talking about intertemporal terms of trade. These are interest rates. So I will not address like unilateral tariff policies like the recent EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. But if I had multiple goods in the economy, besides talking about intertemporal trade, I would be able also to talk about tariffs. So what I'm going to find is the optimal unilateral policies that will have effectively, there will be two instruments that will decentralize these policies. And we'll have to do, one will be effectively capital controls, which will be essentially your instrument of how you manipulate world interest rates. And I'll find that if my home country grows faster than the foreign country, my policymaker will try to introduce a tax on borrowing, or as you want to think about subsidy on savings. And if my home country grows slower than the foreign country, there will be a tax on savings or a subsidy to borrowing. Furthermore, my domestic carbon tax, the rest of the world does not do anything, it just follows a business as usual policy. I'm going to find there will be, the two policy instruments, capital controls and carbon taxation, will be intertwined. And I will find that my domestic carbon tax will be, although my home country cares only for its own utility, the carbon tax will not just reflect the damages of home, but can be either above or beyond the damages of home. And what will depend on, I will try my carbon tax will be higher than what would be associated to my own country-specific damages if home is a net importer of goods. And actually, my carbon tax can be smaller than what would be the respective one if I only care for my own country, if home is a net exporter of goods. I hope I will have time to go over these results and give you more intuition about that, but this is just a preview. Okay, so I'm going to have a multiple country economy. And when you go to these climate models, so the DICE models, dynamic integrated climate economy models, there are many bells and whistles. I'm going to get rid of all bells and whistles and have essentially the essence of what I need in order to talk about the externalities and the international dimension. So I'm going to have a deterministic multiple country economy. I will also get rid of capital. There's no reason to have effectively capital for what I'm going to talk. And my model is going to be based on effectively a simplified version of the closed economy of Golosov, Kursel, Hassler, Tsevinsky. So we'll be n countries. In each country, there will be two sectors, a final goods sector and a dirty energy sector. I'm not going to talk about clean or dirty energies. I'm just going to have dirty energy. And in each country, there will be some net output, YTL. The superscripts always denote the country. L is the country. It will be some gross output, Y hat TL, that will be produced by, there will be some exogenous process for technology. N is labor. Energy is E. And there will be some country-specific damages that depend on a climate variable S. Country-specific, that's why there's a superscript L here. And energy is produced by just labor, that's allocated to the energy sector, final good sector. Labor is, some labor goes to the final good production, and some labor goes to the production of energy. This is going to be effectively my production function, and the climate variable, this is all, will be effectively a stock of emissions ST that I will assume would, that's what I'm saying. I said I'm cutting down a lot of bells and whistles here. All the climate scientists put a lot of bells and whistles here. Temperature at the surface in the atmosphere, deep ocean. I'm going to simplify all these things by just assuming it just follows a law of motion that depends on the previous stock of emissions. And what? The entire emissions of the world. Right? This is the fact that the international dimension I've been talking, emissions in some country K affect the damages in country L. And this will be durable, increasing the old stock of emissions increase my current emissions and therefore reduce production, right? And so the stock of emissions will act as a durable public bad. Instead of having a public good, it's a public bad, and it's durable. So let's see that's my economy, and we'll have a representative household in each of these countries. Let's see, first of all, the global, the cooperative policy. Assume you have a bunch of Pareto weights, eta L, that add to unity, okay? And the planner will just do what? The global planner, think of that, the guy that designed the Paris Agreement, will maximize a weight utility, the weight utility of all currents of the world, subject to three constraints. What are the three constraints? The global resource constraint, the sum of consumption across countries has to be equal to the sum of net output across countries, okay? The energy sector in each of these countries, energy is just having a production function and an exogenous process ZT for each country, fine. And the law of motion for the stock of emissions. What do we find from this problem? Essentially, there will be three conditions that describe the solution of this problem. One, and think of your standard risk-sharing stuff you did in your first year of your PhD. One is there will be effectively a consumption efficiency condition the ratio of marginal utilities across countries has to be constant, standard stuff. This is despite, this is a standard Pareto problem with some externality. The externality does not affect at all, essentially the consumption efficiency condition. And since across time, there's no uncertainty here, otherwise it would be also across states, the ratio of marginal utilities is constant. This translates, if I had power utility, which will be my main working example, that consumption is just a constant share of world output. Okay. Second, in each country, there will be an optimal intersectoral allocation of labor. Labor is the effective thing, input, how much labor I assign to the final goods sector versus the energy sector is the crucial decision here. So the marginal product of labor in the final good sector has to be equal to the marginal product of labor in the energy sector times the shadow value of producing more energy. And what is this shadow value? That's where the externality comes in. The shadow value of energy has two parts. One is how much product I can get, the marginal product of energy in producing final goods. But second, it has also a cost, which is what? By producing more energy, I increase the stock of emissions, which reduce production. And that's effectively the externality that the private firm will not take into account. And what's important is that this will not depend on country L. So what is this CT? Is effectively the shadow cost of emissions. And follows the following law of motion, recursion, forward recursion. So the shadow cost of emissions is just equal to what? The current global marginal damages. So the planet takes into account how some emission affects the entire global damages, plus the future global marginal damages. Makes sense because you have durability here. If you didn't have durability, this term would not be there. And the product of these two things is essentially what people call in this literature the social cost of carbon. Okay, what about the market economy? If you had a business as usual market economy, fine. Agents would equalize the marginal substitution to the prices. This is just the inverse of the interest rate. So effectively, again, you have equalization of marginal utilities across countries. But of course, the global output would be different in the market economy because of the externality. But the important thing is the optimal intersectoral allocation of labor in each country does not take into account the cost of producing more energy. This translates to, you just equalize the marginal substitution between labor and energy in the final goods sector to the marginal product of labor in the energy sector. That's it. There's no the cost of the externality here, which means firms effectively devote too much labor. They produce too much energy, and they devote too much labor in the energy sector. How can you correct this thing? Introduce a Pigouvian tax, a global unit tax on energy, tau T global, which is effectively this multiplier I had before, times how it converts to emissions. And you have this unit tax to the energy sector firms. Each of them has to pay a tax on the production of energy. And you do that, and all is cool. Done. Perfect. Magic. If you want to have some expressions for this thing, I hope I have time, by the way. No, you had the alarm, right? So, okay, I'm giving to my 10. I'm also the session coordinator here. So let's put some parametric assumptions in these things, and let's put just the assumptions of the effectively extension of the multiple country extension of the parametric assumptions of Golos, of Crucel, and others. Let's assume that the stock of emissions have some transitory, some permanent component X, some transitory component Y, with some parameters phi L, phi 0, phi. Let's assume damages are exponential. Country specific, this is essentially the damage sensitivity, gamma L, and let's assume power utility. And what do you get? The global carbon tax it has this nice formula. It's just the growth rate in some power 1 minus rho. This is stuff about the depreciation of emissions. And the important thing is these are the marginal damages, which are what? The outweighed global marginal damages. Okay. Beyond cooperation. Let's assume now there's no magician here, the global planner, and you have just a country-specific policymaker. And as I said, will be a large emitter and will be also a large participant in international capital markets. And there will be effectively market power in terms of interest rates. In order to understand how this works, let me give you a prelude that imagine, like a thought experiment, imagine I had a large emitter, but my large emitter was a price taker in international capital markets. So imagine the following, I have a large emitter in each country, I'm taking the emissions of the other countries as given, and I try to maximize my own utility of my own country, subject to what? The external constraint of the country, which is consumption plus prices times how much you borrow or save is equal to net output, my energy production function in my country, and the law of emissions. But taking price as given. If you did that, and you use my parametric assumptions I had before, you would get a what? A country-specific carbon tax. That's very similar to the formula I had before, but the important thing is I care only for the marginal damages in my own country. Makes sense. I care for my own utility, I care only for my own damages. Let's go now to market power. Effectively, will be like a dynamic monopolist problem here. I will not have now n countries. I'll just assume I have 2 countries. Let's call the one home, country 1. Let's call the other foreign, country 2. And the protocol effectively I'm going to follow is the protocol of a JP paper by Costino, Verni, and Lorenzoni in 2014. So my home country will be my large emitter, large participant, understands how prices are formed. My foreign country will be passive. Fine. Well, interest rates will be what? Beta times the marginal rate substitution between in country 2, right? So, and my home country will understand this relationship. And everybody will start with a 0 foreign asset position. As I said, there will be 2 instruments of decentralized allocation, a carbon tax and a tax on borrowing and saving. So let's see the problem. What's the problem? The problem in my country, in my home country, in this large country, will be I maximize all my own utility, subject to what? The world resource constraint, consumption in my country plus consumption in the world is equal to the total output in the world. My own energy production function, the law of emissions for the law of motion for the stock of emissions, and what? As I said, you take into account prices, so you take into account that whatever you do has satisfied the batch constraint of the foreign country. Effectively, this is this condition, which is the intertemporal batch constraint of the foreign country. You may think of that as an implementability constraint if you're familiar with Ramsey. And so the way you should think about this problem is like I have a monopolist that faces a competitive fringe. Essentially, it's exactly this setup here. Now, let's see. Now, my country, I choose my own consumption, but I take into account how I affect the consumption of the rest of the world. Why? Because the consumption of the rest of the world affects prices, and therefore it affects what I'm selling and buying in international markets. So what's the optimal choice of consumption in the rest of the world? Let me open that. So, on the one hand, if I increase consumption in the rest of the world, it does what? I have a cost because I lose some marginal utility. But on the other hand, I affect prices. How do I affect prices? By increasing consumption in the rest of the world, I decrease marginal utility, and therefore I decrease prices. And this decrease in prices is this term here effectively. Is it beneficial or harmful to me? Well, if I reduce prices, it's beneficial if I'm buying goods. That means I have net imports. It is harmful if I'm selling goods, that is, if I have net exports. So the entire action will be coming by this term here, and it's exactly coming from the market power of my home country. Let's see how it translates in terms of consumption shares. So remember, I had before, when I was writing down the cooperative solution or the market solution, the ratio of marginal utilities was constant. Now, the ratio of marginal utilities will not be constant, but will depend on this variable called price wage. So I will call it KT, which will depend on the elasticity of the marginal utility of the foreign country times essentially the net good position, if I'm a buyer or seller. So you may think of that effectively as a time-varying inverse Pareto weight, which normally would be constant, now it's time-varying. If I assumed also my power utility, as I had before, I can express this formula as in terms of shares of consumption, and I will have time-varying consumption shares. I'm running out of time, so I want to skip. Let me give you, I want to go to the carbon tax and then I'll finish. So, but what's important here is that normally I will have a constant consumption share, whereas here I have a consumption share that depends on my effectively how much, what's my share of output in total words output. And that's an increasing function. And here I have my price wage. So the important thing is, in order to implement this allocation, you may need to introduce effectively a wage, a tax, in borrowing or saving. But let's go to the carbon tax, because my session coordinator is getting too stressed that we're running out of time, so I'm getting stressed as well. So let's go to the most important part. Now, forget the tax on borrowing or saving. It's all about the time-varying Pareto weights here because of market power. Let's see the shadow cost of emissions. And remember, you implement that by, which is the effect of the multiplier on the stock of emissions. So what do you have? I care for my own country. It has some, so I take into account the marginal damage to my own home country, but I take also into account the damage in the other country, although I don't care for the utility. But I care for foreign damages because they affect world output, and therefore they affect how much I trade with them. So but this can be either positive or negative. So if I'm a net buyer, if my net imports are negative, so if my net exports are negative, so if I have net imports, my foreign damages are costly to me because I'm trading them, I'm buying stuff from them. So the cost of emissions is increasing for me and the carbon tax is increasing. If on the other hand, if I'm a net seller, foreign damages are beneficial to me. So actually, I may even reduce my carbon tax. Even more interesting, imagine you're a country that has zero damages completely. I don't care, I have no damage at all. However, I may introduce a carbon tax or even a carbon subsidy because this can be negative. Why? Because I may want to affect my position in international markets if I'm a buyer or seller. And, you can have the parametric examples, get a nice formula here. So I'm actually on time. So the important thing is, I said that this work is preliminary. Of course, a natural question that arises is how important are the results quantitatively on capital controls and carbon taxes? You may think, what if, fine, I follow unilateral policies, but assume I want to save the world. I'm altruistic, my home country, and I maximize the welfare, utility of home and foreign. Would things change qualitatively? Similar mechanisms would emerge. Another very important question that I'm not addressing at all now, maybe in the future, is what if these guys were Nash? What if, effectively had carbon tax and capital control wars, and each of them was following their own carbon tax and their own tax on savings or borrowing? What would happen there? It's an open question. I don't know. Well, thank you. I'll finish here.
I think it does it work? Yeah. Thanks a lot, Reese and David, for having me as a discussant to Anastasia's paper. So I'll try to stick to the time, and if I can do a little bit better, so I'll try to do that. So a quick summary, and since Anastasia took the time to basically go through everything, let me just give the big highlights that I had throughout the paper, the last version that he sent me. The main idea is to try to compare between two scenarios. The first one where we have a multi-country setting and we're trying to internalize the climate externality and finding essentially what would be that social cost of carbon or the Pigovian tax. And then he goes on to try to see how does that compare, or like how does it fail when we're having different type of scenarios, one of which we have a home and a foreign country, and that cooperation kind of breaks. And that's the last points that he was kind of mentioning with respect to the Pigovian tax, where it depends on those sort of trading volumes and the differences between the two countries. Now, the high points of the paper, and I think what I thought is really interesting and where the paper can really push through and can have some sort of interesting findings and policy recommendations. I think the idea of bringing both the constant, and all and Golosov and all in the same sort of framework, where if you're not very familiar, the Golosov and all paper is a kind of similar paper where essentially they're trying to understand what would be the social cost of carbon when we internalize the externality, the climate externality, and bringing it with like a multi-world region framework to try to see how everybody interacts and all the countries in such context. There is this sort of interesting exercise where the author carries this cooperation type framework between all these countries and shows how that social cost of carbon kind of like extrapolates. And basically when we have just one country, that's just a reduced form of such a case. But then goes beyond that and tries to understand what happens when we don't have this cooperation word, which I think is very important because we cannot take it as given. There might be free riding, there might be sort of like different aspects of it that can lead it to fail, and those will be the coming points I'll be discussing. And I think, as you mentioned at the end, those incentives depend on whether basically a country is a net exporter or net importer, and that would have an impact on the carbon price. And I think that's the sort of last point you've been touching based on the tax and subsidy. I think these are like really interesting points, specifically the last ones that could make the paper really interesting from a policy perspective. Now, areas that I think could be improved, specifically in the context of the new findings and the new papers that have been coming up in the climate economics literature. So I'll start with the first aspect, which is the energy modeling. In the paper, we consider only, consider only that output is purely coming from energy. So energy will be the sort of what would replaces physical capital or produce capital in the standard RBC type framework. Now that energy is purely fossil energy, or what you call dirty energy. Now, by not allowing firms to abate, which means to invest in some cleaner technologies, they're just going to be facing a carbon tax all along the pathway. And that's not very realistic. And I think there are two avenues how to probably go from here, either to include some abatement, and therefore that will engage firms with some abatement costs. I think the work of Nordhaus and others has done that extensively. But I think a new avenue, and I think it's probably more, not necessarily eloquent, but I think more what the literature has been going through these days, is to consider just a substitution between fossil and renewable. I think a CES function could allow for doing that quite easily, avoiding to even go deeply in some abatement costs that has been calibrated not in the best way, especially following on the work of Nordhaus. So I think one of the two avenues, probably the second one, will be probably the most appropriate one to go through. Now, energy itself in this specific framework so far only relies on labor. But to produce energy, we know that there is a big importance in terms of produced capital, physical capital. And that's going to be key and very important, especially along the transition. So I think having physical capital in the energy production is going to be very important, especially will imply some strong dynamics on interest rates, which can reverberate further back on wages, labor dynamics, and capital investment reallocation, especially along the transition when we include carbon taxation. And I think the last point, probably minor, but fossil fuel should be considered as an exhaustible finite resource. And therefore, in this specific case and context, it only relies on labor, which means it grows constantly over time. And that's not very realistic. If we have some sort of like limit, some S bar, which will be the total stock of fossil fuel available, we could allow for discoveries that would allow us to have a Hotlin rule with respect to energy prices, and therefore will have an impact on the carbon taxation as well. So I think important to include. Now, from the climate modeling part, I think this is something that has been a huge debate over the climate economics literature. I understand that you follow Golosov and all quite closely, but there've been a lot of updates since then. I think two avenues to go from there are either to consider the Matthews and all science paper that has been taken off quite substantially lately, where essentially the main difference is that there is no such transitory and permanent aspects, which are highlighted through the three first equations in the paper, actually. But just to consider that the total cumulative stock of emissions, ST, is just the previous stock, whatever is here, plus the flow of emissions. That phi, what Matthews argues, is very close to 1. In fact, it's 1. And therefore makes a relationship between cumulative stock and emissions. And that's where there is the sort of decay that one can think about. Another way is to really go full in, which you mentioned, but probably to keep it more stylized. That's why I put this one as first. But the second is just to see whether the dynamics can change quite substantially, is to include something a la Follini and all, a very recent paper in Review of Economic Studies, where essentially they really revisit everything that has been done and show how it should be correctly calibrated with respect to radiative forcing and so on. I won't go too much in that, but if you want more references, I can provide that in that specific context. I think the last maybe point that I wanted to highlight is this idea of cooperation, and I kind of already touched a little bit based on that. I think some key points is that whether the cooperation is given. I mean, we saw the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, so we cannot just assume that specifically, so we have to think about that. And I think there is a paper by Nordhaus, an AR paper, very nice, speaking about countries creating clubs and making it that there is no incentives to deviate. I think Europe uses the border adjustment controls in some sort of similar manner. The implications of climate-related policies in the world context. There is a paper by Ferrari and Pagliari in the Journal of International Economics that is very quite close to yours. That would be interesting to see and see how you can contrast the paper with respect to what they do. And I think the main point that I had is probably just the positioning of the paper in the larger literature of the general equilibrium models that look at the input-output tables and the trade to essentially look at these climate policies in the world context. I think there is definitely a room there. Just the better positioning would be probably important. And I think the cursing and all is quite a good starting point to just see what has been happening in the literature in the specific context. Now, these are just some suggestions that I think could be worth pursuing, especially now that you have a model that kind of incorporates all these aspects. And I'm finishing here. So I think you could look at probably the dynamics of the transition, especially that you have a nice model to do that. So looking at the differences between the global north and the global south, specifically when we're basically having this global carbon taxation. The dynamics of the social cost of carbon that could be very different depending on the trade powers between these countries. A welfare analysis, are they losers, are they winners in here? And I think this has been discussed quite substantially by the likes of Per Crucel and others. And I think the rest was mainly probably to thinking about adding maybe trade more in a substantial way than just looking at the bonds market. I think an input-output word table could be quite a nice way to go. But again, this might be another paper, so it was more like a broader suggestion at this stage. And hopefully I stick to time.
one question there. Okay, then one first. Yes, thank you.
That was, thanks. That was very interesting. Just on the point of carbon tax, I understand that being an ESG consultant, I try and encourage companies to try and be more sort of carbon neutral, sort of be more responsible. But my point here is that when you have countries at the moment, for example, if you take the cocoa trade, when the chocolate trade happening, where EU already have restrictions on making sure that farmers are, it can be traced back to the farmers. The farmers right now are already having problems when it comes to producing cocoa, which means, and producing chocolate, which means that the actual price of chocolate goes up. They're having problems in trade. That is why the farmers are producing less. They're not doing anything in regards to the disease with their crops. So how can, when you talk about the home carbon tax, how is that going to help those farmers if they're already having to pay tax on top of the problems that they are facing in terms of the chocolate production itself and the transportation? Because if the cocoa lands or the chocolate lands in the EU ports, they're rejected if they can't be traced back to the farmers, and these farmers are losing jobs. Countries are not looking after the farmers. So how is where you have emerging markets, the tax is going to really help them?
Enjoyed the talk, Tassos. Thanks. It's probably beyond this paper, but looking at the sort of the fringe, they're on their Euler equation, and when I think of some of the debates about damage being experienced by countries other than the ones who've actually produced it or caused it, I think of very poor countries, and I think of countries that have massive financial frictions, maybe not even participating in some markets. I just wonder if there's an easy way to somehow get in the idea that they might not be on an Euler equation, they might not be participating in some of the same financial markets, but again, probably beyond. But just thinking about that differential participation that seems to be correlated with the flows, the direction of flows of the damage.
I'm Tony from the Central Bank of Nigeria. So my question is similar to what Reese was asking. So is there is it possible to create a scenario where in the cooperative gains, we could have, in addition to the Pigovian tax, you could have something like reparative costs where the large emitters actually pay some reparative costs to countries that aren't emitting so much?
I didn't hear.
Once more.
Oh yeah, so what I said is it's similar to what Reese said earlier. So is it possible, in addition to the Pigovian tax, to have a situation where based on the stock of your emissions, countries who emit more actually pay reparative costs to...
What cost?
Reparative costs.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
That's what I missed. Okay, sounds good. Okay, so first of all, thanks to Gassan. So should I reply first to his discussion or to the questions? Okay, fine. So I'll start with Gassan. So I mean, there was a conscious decision here, as I said during the presentation, to cut. I'm very sympathetic to all the extensions, having various type of energies, clean, dirty, coal, fossils, renewable resources. But it was a conscious decision to cut down on all the stuff, because what I want in the end is to talk about optimal policy across countries. And if I introduce all this stuff, actually, it may not have a clear picture. You may not have a clear picture. Of course, I'm not saying this stuff is super important quantitatively. So But my first objective was to really understand the mechanisms here, even in this simplified setup. I mean, the same comment holds also for the non-renewable resources. Obviously, you could have that as well, and having a hoteling rule there as well. Now, in terms of where this thing stands as work is. As work, where it's placed in the literature is about the analysis beyond cooperation. I have to do the cooperative solution in order, first of all, to understand where I start from. But I don't think there has been a lot of analysis in dynamic setups, dynamic general equilibrium setups beyond cooperation. Now, there's so many interesting questions there happening. So I have only one good, but obviously having also trade and talking about tariffs, super, super important. There is work in trade, in the quantitative trade literature, where people are thinking about how you do, how to use tariffs in order to mitigate the effects of climate changes, and also work on unilateral policies. Like Kortum has a nice paper on that, but these are mainly on static setups. In dynamic setups, not much. Of course, you understand if I have, dynamics and serious trade, this and having also non-cooperative play no cooperative here, it will be, maybe a model that we may need 3 years to understand what's going on. That's a different story. But these are super, super interesting directions for future research. But mainly the work there is mainly static. Now, on the questions from the audience, we make simplified assumptions here. Let's go to the farmer's question. In what sense there's a representative household in one country? Obviously, trying to figure out having a bunch of heterogeneous agents in the country, having farmers, workers, and trying to understand how all these kind of policies affect these people and the welfare, and inequality. It's super, super important. I abstract from all these questions, and I don't have an answer to that, but these are very legitimate questions. Here, I'm going to, a step back and just treat everybody as a representative and not treat, and not going deeper into these issues. Paper to write on that. So I don't have an answer to that. So on risk, obviously if you don't trade in temporarily, you're not on the earlier equation, you may, I want to have only the climate externality as friction. You can introduce a bunch of other externalities and have much more. Obviously, then policy will not. Now, policy was exhibiting stuff that had to do with the climate externality plus the market power international markets, right? Now, if I add also other frictions, many more interactions may happen. Now, think of that as two countries. OECD, no OECD countries, or two big trade partners, and that's it. Where if you want to do quantitatively, what is, then obviously you have to be more careful about the data. But I have not done any data work yet. When I go quantitative, I'll be very careful about which countries I will consider in order to think about that. And also the question of the Nigeria Central Bank, there may be several instruments had decentralized allocation. Here I focus on. So you could have the reparation costs, as you mentioned. You could have that as well. I'm not considering that, but you could, here you affect the margins with the tax, but you can also think in terms of quantities, you can think in terms of reparations, or you can think, several different ways. So I think I'm running out of time. Sorry.
Climate economics in a small omnibus. Our second presenter is Florencia Herrera of the Federal Reserve. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, okay. So hello everyone, and thank you so much to the organizers for having me here. The paper I'm going to present is called The Green Metamorphosis of a Small Open Economy, and is a joint work with Evi Papa and Hernan Seoane. And as I work at the Federal Reserve, the standard disclaimer applies. So I think it's very nice that we have these two papers in the same session because they are very complementary, both in terms of the research question and also in the modeling part. So now we are going to focus on those small open economies that were not included in the first plot that motivated the first paper. So, as you may know, many small open economies, and especially emerging countries, are lagging behind in the adoption of clean energy. And this is true when we look at the ratios of renewable sources of energy over total energy consumption, or if we look at the installed capacity that these countries have in order to produce the green energy. And part of the reason why this is the case is the presence of very low fiscal incentives to adopt the green technology in those economies. So most of these countries don't have a carbon trading system. They have very low or inexistent carbon taxes. And in many of those countries, they still have subsidies to fossil fuels. So there is still a lot to do towards the green transition in those economies. And even though the individual contribution to global carbon emissions in these countries may be very low, if we consider all the small open economies as a whole, they certainly have a sizable contribution. So it is important to understand also how the macroeconomic dynamics of the green transition in those economies will be. Yes, and that is the objective of this paper. So here we propose a canonical model to study the macroeconomic impact of the green transition in a small open economy, where this green transition is triggered by alternative fiscal policies. In particular, we propose a new Keynesian, a small open economy with endogenous growth and two types of energy, green and brown, where green energy represents the renewable sources of energy and is domestically produced in this small open economy, while brown energy represents polluting sources of energy, and in this case is exogenously given. So in our calibration, we're going to have that the small open economy imports the brown energy from the rest of the world. The second main feature of the model is given by endogenous growth. And here we have directed input-saving technical change between energy and other inputs of production, so labor and capital. And here the intuition is that even though the elasticity of substitution between energy and capital may be fixed and low in the short term, so if firms face a shock in the price of energy, they may be constrained in their response in the short term. What they can do is to invest in R&D to improve the efficiency in the use of energy, and with that, they can increase the substitutability in longer horizons. So this mechanism is going to play a key role in our transitions here. So this characteristic of the model, together with endogenous production of green energy, embeds the model with supply-side effects of the green transition. So this, together with the fact that we study small open economy, constitute the main contributions of this paper. Finally, we use this model we calibrate this model to Chile, where is a representative small open economy and representative emerging markets. But the model is flexible enough to accommodate or to be representative for other countries and their alternative calibrations. So we propose we start from an initial steady state. And we are going to have the announcement of different fiscal policies, in particular, an increment in carbon taxes, an introduction of a subsidy to the production of green energy, or the increase in public investment in green capital, so infrastructure or a specific capital that you need to produce the green energy. And the introduction or the announcement of these instruments will endogenously take the economy towards a new steady state. So here we are interested in the transition between those two. And with this, we offer a laboratory for policy evaluation and welfare implications under alternative instruments. Okay, so the economy, or let me summarize the model before showing you some equations. So the small open economy here is populated by a representative household. We have the production of brown and green energy. intermediate goods, that is where we are going to have sticky prices or the nominal friction. This intermediate good is produced by combining the two types of energy together with labor and capital. And then the final good will combine all the varieties of intermediate goods. And with this, this representative firm produces the domestic good that can be traded internationally. Okay, and behind or in the background, we also have the monetary and the fiscal authority. Okay, so now I'm going to show you details about some of the agents of the model, but keep in mind that behind we have some standard features of a small open economies model. So the optimization problem of the representative household is the following. It has to maximize the lifetime utility by choosing consumption, two types of bonds, one that is in domestic currency, the other that is in foreign currency. So this gives rise, I don't know if you can see the red dot. Perfect. This gives rise to the exchange rate here and to a sovereign spread that is important in emerging markets. And then this household has also to take the decision about investment. But here we have traditional capital, but also there is a stock of green capital. So this is a specific capital that can only be used to produce the green energy in this economy. And this is also a decision of the household. Finally, this household perceives all the profits in the economy and has to pay lump sum taxes to the government. Intermediate goods have some standard characteristics, so they produce in a monopolistic competition fashion. They are subject to Rothenberg adjustment cost, but here technology is important. So in this case, each variety I that is produced in this economy is produced by combining traditional inputs of production, capital and labor, together with energy. And here total energy is a composite of green and brown, which are imperfect substitutes. Okay, so here we are going to have some of the channels that we were discussing before. Now, this is the elasticity of substitution between total energy and traditional capital. And this is the one that I was mentioning is fixed in the short term. But notice that productivity in the two sectors is different. And in this case, it's going to be endogenous. In the next slide, I will give you some details. But let me also mention that in this paper, when I talk about a carbon tax, I will be talking about a tax to brown energy consumption. So notice that here I never mentioned emissions, carbon emissions. And the reason is that, as we saw in the previous paper, the traditional way of modeling this in macro models is by considering the global stock of carbon emissions in the atmosphere, which depends on the local and global contribution. And here the local contribution of a country like Chile is less than 1%. So really this wasn't playing a big role in the model. So in the baseline, we are abstracting from that. And carbon tax is on the consumption of brown energy. Now, directed technical change. So here we assume, as Hasler and co-authors, that there is a stock of researchers normalized to 1. This is the stock N. And these researchers can be assigned to increase the productivity in the traditional sector, to here, or to increase the efficiency in the use of energy. But notice that here there is a trade-off, because if you assign more researchers to energy, then the productivity of the traditional capital is also affected. And we assume that this N, so this allocation of researchers, is also a choice variable for the representative firms. Green energy production here is quite simple, let's say. Here firms maximize profits. They have to pay the returns to green capital that is accumulated by the household. And they can perceive a subsidy to the production of green energy. And finally, we have the last policy instrument in this paper, that is the accumulation of green capital from the government. So here, the total stock of green capital that you need to produce the green energy can be accumulated both by the private sector, that is, in this case, the representative household, or by the government, which constitutes the public capital here. Okay, And of course, we're going to have a parameter that summarizes the complementarity or substitutability between private and public capital. Well, brown energy, I mentioned it, here is exogenously given, so the small open economy has an endowment of brown energy, and this endowment can be traded internationally at the international price. And the domestic price of brown energy will also depend on the real exchange rate. And to close the model, we model also the government. We have a central bank that here is very simple. So here the central bank only sets the domestic interest rate by following a standard Taylor rule. So it's not applying, or it's not playing a direct role in the green transition. It will just react to inflation and output. But the fiscal authority is the one that is doing the work here. So here the fiscal authority has to satisfy the budget constraint. And as you can see, different fiscal instruments are also going to affect the public finances in different ways. And finally, there is a fiscal rule here that tells us that even though this transition could be initially be financed by increasing government debt, in the end, taxes need to ensure the debt sustainability. So the domestic households will be the ones that pay for this transition in the end. Okay, so I think I have like 10 or 15. 7, okay, so faster. So, well, just a technical note. Today I'm going to talk about variables, detrended variables, okay? But in the background, we have different growth rates, a balanced growth path, and so on. But today, detrended variables. And here we solve for the perfect foresight solution. So we are going to look at the scenario where all the policies are announced in the initial steady state. So all the information is received there, and we study the transition. Calibration, as I mentioned, we try to match the initial situation, so the initial steady state, and then we study the transition by increasing fiscal policies. So forget about calibration, just notice that we match standard first order moments for Chile, such as the average inflation rate of 4%, average debt to GDP. We also have some targets for the variables in the energy parameters, such as the ratio of imported over total energy. And this is important. In the initial steady state, 72% of total energy comes from brown or polluting sources of energy. Okay. So let's go to the baseline transition, which consists of a carbon tax hike from $5 to $35 per ton, as in the climate plan for Chile. Now, if you compare this with European numbers, this is super low, and it's true, but these are the current numbers. And still, this implies an increase of 7 times in the carbon tax, so it's quantitatively important here. Well, I'm going to show you the first 40 years of the transition here. And the first result is that this increase in carbon taxes generates a fall in the consumption of brown energy of roughly 35%. So let me explain some of the dynamics. So here, when the carbon tax is introduced, we have that the domestic price of brown energy increases. And this is what triggers the decrease in the consumption of brown demand. So here we have a substitution of brown for green energy. And that is why the green energy expands under the introduction of carbon tax. However, here demand of green energy increases faster of supply because we need to accumulate the green capital in order to be able to produce the green energy. So under this situation, the price of green energy is higher, so it increases along the transition. So now both prices of energy are increased after the introduction of brown energy, and this introduces an increase in marginal cost for firms that end up generating inflationary pressures. Notice that inflation increases from 4% to 8 or 9% in the first year, and then this goes down, but it still remains above the initial steady state for many periods. So the inflationary pressures are quite persistent. Second, we have now that energy is the expensive input of production. So what firms try to do is to reallocate researchers to decrease the cost of production. So here researchers in the traditional sector go down and firms try to reallocate them to improve the efficiency in the use of total energy. And that is what ends up generating a fall in the total energy consumption. Okay. But at the same time, the efficiency in the use of traditional capital decrease, so this generates a fall in capital investment, what ends up generating a recession that, even though it's not that important quantitatively, notice that it's still very persistent and output remains below the initial steady state for the initial 40 periods. And finally, even though GDP is lower, debt to GDP in this scenario decreases because carbon taxes represent higher revenues for the government. Well, let me skip the small open economy part, but in one phrase, this generates the dynamic of a sudden stop. So we have a depreciation, we have an increase in country spreads and in the trade balance. In the paper, we have several sensitivity analyses, especially with related to the elasticities of substitution. And we also look at the case of the exporter country and the complementarity in the green capital. But let me go to the second part. So I mentioned that carbon taxes generate a decrease in brown energy usage of 35%. So what can we do with other instruments? So here we try to find the increase in green subsidies and public investment in the green capital that can generate at the end of the transition the same decrease in brown energy, okay, roughly 35%. However, these instruments need huge fiscal expansions in order to decrease the brown energy in this model. So we find that they can attain the same reduction in brown energy only if green subsidies increase to 300%, so 12% of GDP, and public investment to 7% of GDP. So these are, of course, we know these may not be implementable, but let me show you, or let me compare the dynamics that these policies would generate, just to compare with the carbon tax. So here we are comparing in blue the carbon tax dynamics that I showed you before with the introduction of public investment. And here the main difference is that when the government starts to accumulate the green capital, it increases the productivity in the green sector. So the green energy sector or production increases along the transition, and also the prices of green energy go down. So this is what, or is closer to the dynamics that we would expect for green, or for the price of green energy along this kind of transition. And due to this, we have that several of the dynamics that I described before happen here with the opposite sign. So this generates a fall in the price of marginal cost, introduces downward pressures in inflation, and then firms start to reallocate researchers from the energy sector to the traditional capital, and this triggers an increase in capital investment, avoids the recession, but the cost is the huge increase in debt to GDP. Very similar with green subsidies. The difference, or one of the main difference here, is that the domestic price of brown energy goes down. This is triggered by a fall in domestic absorption. But again, no inflationary pressures and no recession under this kind of instruments. So how much? 5? 1 minute. Okay. I always think I have more. Okay, so to take stocks here, the cost of the transition depend on the fiscal policy instruments. Carbon taxes introduce inflation and output losses, while public investment or subsidies are deflationary and have no output cost, but they generate losses in terms of energy efficiency and very high fiscal costs. We also look at the role of monetary policy, but with only one instrument, we only find that it can moderate the greenflation, but output costs and fiscal costs remain higher or even higher. And of course, the natural extension here is to look at the policy mix, because by combining carbon taxes with subsidies or with public investment, we are able to alleviate some of the unintended consequences. And we can also use the revenues from carbon taxes to finance subsidies or public investment. The dynamics are in between the two I showed you. Just to close with welfare, we also look at welfare here. And we find first that carbon tax is the first one in the ranking, so it's the best instrument as in the standard literature. But here the green transition implies welfare losses in the transition. And this is natural because here in the baseline, we don't have any externality. So the optimal policy for household is do nothing. So they don't want any kind of intervention. But of course, with that, the consumption of green energy will not increase, or the consumption of brown will not change. So also find that the policy mix can generate some welfare improvements with respect to the pure instruments. And well, we have some extensions, but I will leave it here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so let me see. A lot of. Okay, so thanks a lot. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Reese, for having me here. Real pleasure to be back. It's a pleasure to discuss this paper. I found it particularly interesting in terms of a combination of the policy mix. So Florencia did already an excellent job in describing the paper, very eloquently explaining all the mechanism. Let me very briefly summarize it, give you some directional indications of the results, and then some comments. So I think key here is what is the definition of transition. That is all in brown energy use. That's the definition of a green transition in this paper. There is a very interesting assessment of the direct impact on inflation and output based on or depending on a mix of policies, first considered in isolation and then combined. And those policies are carbon taxes, although there's a qualification that Florencia just gave us, and I will ask a question about that, but you partially addressed that. Green subsidies and public investment. And there's also policy, monetary policy too, is a little bit in the background. And exactly, you just mentioned that central bank has really no direct role here. So what are the specific, very interesting and relevant points here? Perhaps the contribution of the paper. There is some element of rigidity in the allocation of researchers, and that's very close to reality. You keep hearing over and over, all countries discussing about the lack of skilled green labor. So that's, I think, is extremely timely and realistic. And then green and brown are not perfect substitutes. So this is something that it's also important to be considered. And then the entire model is calibrated to Chile. And again, a very interesting point that is made in the paper, and Florencia mentioned, not a foregone assumptions, assuming that all the countries that as of now haven't implemented yet a carbon price instrument will implement one, and at what level that will be implemented. Okay, so this is the key model feature, and I would like just to re-emphasize that, and I think is a very interesting one. It's related to this idea of research and productivity. So researchers can be allocated to improve productivity of capital and labor on one side versus efficiency of energy services. And this choice of what is the fraction of researchers you allocate to one or the other is the key element that actually decides what is happening in the model. So this is really what changes the relative price of energy. So that's a key lever in the model. Now, very briefly, what is happening here? When you have an increase in the cost of using brown energy, and I think this is a key of using brown energy, I should have probably put that in italics. What do we see in terms of type of energy? Green energy goes up, use of green energy goes up, use of brown energy goes down, hence we are transitioning. The price of energy, both are actually going up because we have a brown and green, as Florencia was explaining, are not perfect substitutes. So brown energy price goes up, green energy price goes up as well. Therefore, the cost of the intermediate firms, the marginal cost of the intermediate firms goes up, and we have inflation in the short run. There is a reallocation of researchers, but as we just saw, there is an interesting, not immediate reallocation of researchers that will eventually, in the long run, improve energy efficiency, but the productivity of traditional inputs goes down, and that actually leads to a persistent decrease in the output. So basically, brown energy tax has substantial output and inflationary costs. So there is, in fact, a possibility of green inflation here, but in the long run, things are actually getting rosy in terms of transition to low carbon. The other two different tools, I'm just summarizing these together because more or less they have directionally the same results. So green subsidy and public green investment, where by public green investment, we're considering an increase in productivity of green energy. So what we see when these type of policies are implemented, price of green energy goes down. Brown energy will be substituted for the cheaper green energy, but also we see that the energy cost of the firms goes down. This actually improves the total factor productivity of the traditional factors. We don't see the same level of inflation in the short run, and we see also an improvement of the traditional input energy efficiency. So the really big starting difference here is that there's a boost of capital investment and outputs, but there is in fact an opposite effect on a reduction of inflation. But that obviously comes at a cost, at actually quite hefty cost in terms of fiscal costs. Okay, so at some point, this was the result, and now enters externality. And the externality enters via households. So there's a damage that reduce consumptions of households. This is, I think, a very interesting table that, for interest of time, I believe Florencia hadn't had the time to present. So think about no externality. Carbon tax comes first. Green subsidy second, but they're really expensive. So to get as close as carbon tax, you really need to have a really, I think, almost impractical green subsidy. But once you have externality, things are very different. And you want basically a policy mix. The minus means something good, and you see that the combination of a relatively small, not too high carbon tax and green subsidy or green capital investments achieve relatively better results compared to only carbon tax. So the negative number is actually larger, and in particular, even bigger when you have a high level of externality. So basically a bigger impact on the households. Okay, so some questions and clarifications. I think you mentioned already, monetary policy doesn't really play a big direct role in the decision dynamics. That's clear, exactly for the mechanism that Florencia explained, but I think is really a bit undersold in the paper, almost as if is not really, beyond the intuitive results that you would expect, is not really playing any sort of role in the decision to transition to low carbon. There are actually quite interesting presentations of some of the supply friction and substitutability. What are the type of role that they play? You talk quite, you explain very well how a more rigid reallocation of researcher has further implications for inflation and output, lower substitutability in terms of the energy. I haven't seen much of that discussion actually for the elasticity of substitution between private and public stock. You mentioned that. There is a bit of a discussion in the paper that is really minor. I think that should be play up because I think it's extremely key, especially when you talk about the other tools. Here comes something that was really puzzling for me. You mentioned that very briefly at the beginning of your talk. The TAO tax, the carbon tax, is actually a tax on purchases of brown energy. So to me, this is not clear. So it's not really a tax on a per unit of emissions. I understand Chile might be a very small country, but it's actually a tax on the product of price and emissions, as opposed to only emission. That was my understanding. Then there are a few other assumptions that maybe can play an interesting, can provide more nuances. There is an assumption of a quadratic adjustment cost for both capital and green capital, private and public. So that probably also something interesting you want to mention. And then back on the welfare, those numbers, I know you're not doing any sort of optimal analysis here, very well understood, but those numbers, for example, for the high externality of the last two combination are so starkly identical that start making me thinking, what if you just change a little bit of the parameters? Can you actually have a really stronger re-ranking of the mix? Okay, with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have a question on the brown energy, on the one hand on prices and on the other on quantities. So in terms of prices, do you think about this as a stock that is depleted over time, this brown energy source, or is this an endowment per period that is sort of, I can use it or it's gone? In the former case, I would expect that the price would rise at the rate of interest or something like this, but I don't think you had that in the model. And in terms of the quantities, is this thing, if I don't use it domestically, going to be exported to somewhere else? So it's just a source of national income. And how should I think about national welfare in this case? Do you have in mind that the Chilean government cares about sort of the air quality in Santiago? So it only matters what is being burned in Chile, or do they worry about the climate? In which case, when it's exported, who cares? Thank you.
So it's kind of a comment/question. There's a ongoing work by Luca Fornaro, Veronica Guerrieri, and Lucrezia Reichling that has a model is sort of related to yours. And kind of the point they make is that this type of shocks, let's call them, like the introduction of taxes, or in their case are more like constraints, look like in reduced form as an endogenous cost push shock, which I think is also the case in your model. I think you showed that a brown tax, it's a positive cost push shock, basically pushes inflation up. A subsidy to the green sector is deflationary, so it's kind of the opposite effect. You didn't show the combination of the two. Do they end up offsetting each other, or there's still some relative price effect? I guess that depends on elasticity and composition of the two sectors.
Thanks. Very interesting presentation. So I have a couple of questions. First, why the inflation spike is so temporary? And yeah, it's persistent, but why really the initial spike is, I think, last 1 year or so? And is this realistic? And also, why the green subsidies that we will need are so high? I think that the evidence of the investment need for the transition is around 3-4% of GDP at the world level. So why do you find so high numbers? And also why the carbon tax is the best in terms of welfare, given that the subsidies or the public investment has a positive consequence on GDP, and the carbon tax has a negative consequence on GDP and consumption. And also, finally, what about the interest rate on debt, on government debt? So I think it's kind of, is it a risk-free rate that you have on a government debt, or do you have a spread? And is this spread sensitive to the debt to GDP level? So, and also, in terms of numbers, what's the level of debt to GDP that you reach for Chile in your simulation? So, thank you.
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well? Ah, sorry. Okay, let me first react to the discussion. So first, thank you so much for your comments. Let me see. Well, yes, we definitely should talk more about this different calibration for substitutability between green and public and private investment. We have it in the appendix, but you're right. We could show it a bit more. Yes, and the comment about emissions is definitely well taken. So, in fact, that is a question that we have in terms of publications on what should be our baseline model with emissions, but then in the calibration, the local contribution is very low or directly abstract from it. So I'm happy to talk more offline about your point of view. And in terms of the ranking between the different policies in welfare, yes. What do we have? Yes, okay. So here, I didn't have time to explain this very well, but the externalities that we consider is that the consumption of, or the usage of brown energy can affect consumption in the household. So this, yes, is a very particular definition of the externality, and it's a simple way of modeling it. And with that, the reduction of brown affects more the utility. But maybe what is not there is the total consumption of energy, or the expansion in the green energy which could also be alternative definitions of the green transition. So in the initial draft of the paper, our definition of green transition was the ratio of green over total energy. In the end, we changed. And yes, these are definitely things that we have to think a bit more. So thanks. Now, the first question that we had about brown energy, yes, for us it's a flow. So the country receives an endowment of brown energy. That can be, that one is the same in all the periods, but the domestic demand of brown energy changes. So imports can be different outside of the steady state, okay? Because when market's clear, these imports are going to be the difference between the same endowment and the demand from farms who are changing their demand along the transition. And yes, in terms of well, I think I explained prices and quantities, and they care about, yes, so here, typically the literature assumes that what matters for total factor productivity is the global emissions, the global stock of emissions, not even the ones, not the flow of emissions. So that is why we thought that as the domestic contributions of emission to the total stock is so low, this may not be that important. And the thing is that this small open economy cannot affect the behavior of the rest of the world with its policies. So the contribution of the rest of the world here will not be affected by these domestic fiscal policies. But yeah, it's a great point anyways. Andrea, yes, we definitely should look at that paper, and maybe we should relate it to that and show that carbon taxes work as a cost push shock. So that would be, I think, a nice feature to do. Well, when we look at the policy mix, it depends on which scenario we consider, but typically we still have changes in relative prices, so they don't offset completely. Then inflation, well, it's temporary first because the path for policies are announced in the first period. So households here are kind of internalizing all the information at the beginning. We have this pattern. And also other parameters can be affected, such as the persistence in the Taylor rule or the, and other parameters here. Why so high? Yeah, I don't remember the question about subsidies, but I think that, yes, why carbon taxes is best is very related to what I was mentioning before, because subsidies and public investment here, what they do is to increase the demand for green energy, because they decrease the price. Public investment increases productivity in the green sector, while subsidies directly decrease the price. But in the end, it's more difficult for those instruments to crowd out the demand for brown energy.